Realm of Valor, A Noble Duel. By Elton Gar. Datros stood as the soldiers entered the room. He quickly counted them, and was relieved to see that there were the same number as he had sent. As he relaxed, he took his hand off the hilt of his father's sword. The soft warmth of the hilt felt like a connection to his family, and mostly to his father. Still, it was hard to feel good when the soldiers he had sent out had returned unarmed and in their underclothing. Even the boots they wore were far more worn than anything he would allow his soldiers to wear.
What happened?
Datros asked, looking at the commander of the small group, a man who had served under him for almost 3 years and had never failed him before.
They were waiting for us,
the soldier said, looking at the floor.
Raise your eyes when speaking to me. You are a representative of your king, and I will not have you show shame when you did nothing wrong. Or did you fail in some way that I have not seen?
Datros asked.
We lost. We are only alive because the bandits did not choose to kill us,
the soldier said.
There's no shame in losing a battle that you could not win. Now tell me what happened.
We went with the Earl as you told us, dressed in full uniforms and well armed, I assure you.
The man started, and Datros wondered if he should have let them get dressed, but they had gone to battles many times together and they had nothing left to hide from each other.
I don't need the commentary or the apologies. I've already said I see no fault, so unless something you say changes that, let's get it out.
His estates are a day's cart ride from the palace, though he has been taking 3 days because of the bandits in the Greenwood Wilds. But with 10 soldiers and his own guards, we chose to go through the forest.
Let me guess, there was a tree across the path,
Datros said. The bandits had used the same tactic a half-dozen times.
No. You had warned us of that, and we would have been far more prepared. There was an injured young man on the side of the road. We stopped to help him, and as soon as I bent down to check on his wound, a dozen men with bows appeared out of the trees.
So they preyed on your goodwill and ambushed you. Well, you can't expect bandits to be honorable. So how did you end up in your underwear?
Well, first they took our weapons and armor. Then their leader appeared. Tall, with the look of a noble, and he was carrying a sword, though it is illegal for anyone who is not a noble or soldier of the king to do so. It looked well made, though he has robbed enough nobles that may not matter. He pointed out that his men needed new boots, and that since we were willing to stop and help those less fortunate, we should be willing to donate our boots.
And then they gave you theirs,
Datros said, a tad confused.
Their leader said that he had no doubt that the sheriff would replace our boots and uniform, but that he wouldn't see someone's foot injured because they didn't have shoes.
Datros considered taking back what he had said about the honor of the bandits. It was a bit hard to believe, but it seemed to him that they might have some honor.
And then you came back here.
After they took Earl Morton's wagon and everything in it. What would bandits need with a noble's wagon?
Yes. What would someone who is living in the woods want with comfortable seats, a solid roof, and good wheels?
Datros asked. This time when the commander looked at the floor, Datros didn't tell him to look up. He had been trained for years to look at things from the perspective of his enemy, and yet he hadn't even considered their actions.
I assume you understand why they took your weapons and uniforms,
Datros said.
Bandits always need weapons, and the uniforms are likely far warmer than what they have,
the commander said. Datros looked at the man, and wondered how he had failed him so completely in his training. So he said,
Can anyone see any value in having the uniforms of the sheriff's guard?
All of the other men seemed so completely cowed by the conversation that Datros couldn't be certain whether they saw what he saw or not. But one of the men in the back, likely no more than 16, said,
Perhaps they plan to make people think they are the guard.
Excellent logic. That was my first thought as well. That means we will have to change the uniform and send out riders to every noble house in the kingdom, warning them of the possible subterfuge,
Datros said.
That will take weeks,
the commander said.
Did you have something else planned?
Datros asked.
I was going to attempt to capture the bandits,
the commander said.
I think we have given them quite enough weapons.
Then seeing the reaction of his commander, Datros said,
No, I don't hold it against you. You brought your men home alive, and that's what matters. But I think we're going to have to change tactics with this particular band of thieves.
The seat from the noble's wagon wasn't as mobile as most of the things in the small band's camp, but it made up for that by being far more comfortable than anything else. His two lieutenants sat across from him. The largest of the two, and one of the tallest men that Atream had ever met, put his feet on a wide flat stump that sat between the two padded seats from the wagon. It was a minor miracle that anyone had shoes that Jovan could wear, and the man seemed almost drunk with happiness. Or perhaps he actually was drunk. Several of the men had been working on making alcohol for the camp, and Jovan was helping them by testing the results.
So, what do we do with the uniforms?
Wilbur asked. He was wearing one of the soldiers' caps on his head, though it was too big and so flopped over to its side, making him look even younger than he was and not entirely serious. Though as the only other person of noble birth in the camp, he was technically second in command. The torn shirt and fake wound still showed at his side. Atream almost told him to clean it, but he seemed proud of the work.
Nothing.
But if you didn't plan to, what was the point of stealing their uniforms?
Wilbur asked.
It was very funny,
Jovan said, but he must know that Atream hadn't gone to that much work for a simple joke.
Using the uniforms would be a perfectly good idea against most commanders, but the sheriff is too well trained to not see the possibilities. He is certainly preparing for us to attempt some type of plot.
But if you knew that, why bother?
Because Datros will have no choice but to send messages out to every noble explaining that the uniform has been changed, and not to trust anyone with the old uniform.
So he will be telling every noble that he lost,
Wilbur said.
Which will help to undermine his authority, and more importantly, that of the king's. But that's only half of it. It has to be done quickly, and he has to assume that we'll be watching for the messages. That means he'll have to send his men out in groups to ensure the messages reach the nobles.
and we can ambush them as they go,
Jovan said. He was a good man, but more of a blunt instrument than Atream would have preferred in a lieutenant. That was why he'd probably never be a commander.
I had considered that. But they'll be in civilian clothing, so the only way we could catch them would be to start attacking any group on the road, and we've built up a trust I'm not willing to destroy.
Well, then I'm out of ideas,
Wilbur said.
as am I.
Jovan said after a few seconds.
Let me explain. He will have to send hundreds of soldiers out of the city all at the same time, and he doesn't have time to call in the reserves. While he's gone, we'll sneak into the city and depose the king, and put in a ruler who won't starve his own people to make himself more powerful.
But even with hundreds of soldiers gone, we'll be outnumbered 10 to 1, and we can't disappear into the city as easily as the woods,
Jovan said.
That's the other half of the plan. Datros is a brilliant strategist and a good man, but he also is far too trusting. That's why my brother has continued to serve the king even after he had our father killed. I've been making contacts in the city guard for months. All they'll have to do is delay the response, and by the time the backup arrives, it will all be over.
It had been far too long since Datros had seen his younger brother. He embraced him heartily and then said,
Come into my home. Your home too, if you ever accept my invitation to join the king's court.
Someone has to manage our lands, and I am already gone too much. That, and the king's taxes have made life hard for anyone who isn't a noble.
The king understands the difficulty, but there are many threats that those taxes help to protect us against. Phrynacia has been growing its armies for years. There are rumors of another wizard, and there is a group of bandits who have been disrupting the trade routes.
I was under the impression that the bandits only attacked nobility. It is why I came in a merchant caravan.
Atream said. Datros had noticed that his brother had arrived in a less dignified way than their station suggested. A duke, or more accurately someone acting in the place of a duke, needed to carry an air of dignity, and it was more important now than ever. The king may have ended the practice of the nobles voting for king, but the other houses still looked to theirs for leadership in times of trouble. It was why the leader of their house had so often held the position of sheriff.
Half the trade in the kingdom is nobles, and you know as well as any that rumors tend to become what people fear rather than remaining the truth. And the merchants fear that they'll be next.
Does anyone know why the bandits aren't already attacking them? They have as much to steal as the nobility, and often have fewer guards.
Atream said. Datros knew his brother likely knew more than he was letting on. They had never been close. The difference in their ages was enough that Datros had left to train with the king's troops before Atream turned 13 and became a man. But they had the same father, even if Atream had been young when he died.
This isn't purely about money. Or at least not money for the bandits. They're trying to weaken King Vorgin.
King Vorgin the Second,
Atream said, making special emphasis on the word second. He was making a point, though he was also forced to speak loud over the banging of the city streets that was louder than normal today.
He prefers people not refer to him that way,
Datros said.
because his father was a good king, and he wants to be associated with him. I'll bet if you asked, some percentage of the lower class doesn't even know that the old king is dead. Sometimes I even wonder about the nobility.
The nobility knows he's dead.
Datros said, but he couldn't argue about the other. News traveled slowly, and the king had made some effort to keep the change in the court obscured.
And yet they act like they don't. Did you even receive any formal protests when Vorgin II made himself a tyrant?
Atream asked.
This is getting dangerously close to treason.
Datros said, his words emphasized by the thuds of noise outside of his windows. If this wasn't so important, he might go out to see what was happening.
Are we not even allowed to discuss the actions of King Vorgin II inside our own home, among members of our family?
It's just that he's not a tyrant. He's his father's son. He just needs help to be a good king.
He killed his own father, and then had our father executed for investigating it. And then he abolished the law that said nobles voted for the king. He is by any reasonable definition a tyrant, and yet you serve him as loyally as our father served his.
Atream said, his voice rising for the first time in the conversation.
No one ever found evidence that the king was assassinated.
Datros said.
Because the only person who was gathering information about the king's death was executed, and after that, everyone was too scared to do anything.
What would you have me do? He is king, and no one else even had the courage to investigate that last king's death.
I'd have you go home. Take a couple of weeks off to check on your holdings. No one will question it.
Atream said, and Datros saw that the man had put his hand on the hilt of the sword that he carried. Datros, feeling a familiar warmth emanating from the sword at his side, took 2 steps back, far enough that he was unlikely to be caught off guard, and said,
It's you. You're the leader of the bandits.
We're not bandits. We just don't have enough soldiers to fight the king the way that the nobles do. And I was hoping that we might help them understand the damage he is doing, if it cost them something, and not just the underclass.
Datros reached for their father's sword that hung on his belt, the blade glowing softly in response to his touch, but Atream said,
I didn't come alone. Now if you're willing to kill me, that might not matter. But you're not.
You need to leave.
Datros said.
He's not worth your loyalty.
Atream said, and he turned, showing his back to his brother, a sign of trust that Datros wasn't sure he could show to his brother.
Our family has served this kingdom for generations. I won't abandon that.
Datros said.
Neither will I.
Atream said as the door shut behind him.
That was a bust.
Yovan said as Atream walked out of his brother's door. The huge man carried a walking stick that was taller than most men. The staff allowed him to carry a weapon in the city without breaking the king's law.
My brother is too good a man for his own good. And if we give him time, he might rally the city guard. That's why we need to make sure he doesn't get that time.
Atream said, and nodded towards 2 of the men who had been nailing the other doors and windows of Datros's small but elaborate home shut. It wouldn't take him long to get out. Perhaps an hour or 2, but hopefully that would be long enough.
Then we start the plan.
Yovan said.
Unless something has gone wrong, The plan has been going for several hours,
Atream said. He had sent Wilbur ahead of them to contact their allies in the city guards and King's Guard. There weren't a lot of them, perhaps one for every 5 men, but he had been careful about who he picked. Many of them were messengers, and there were a couple who sent messages. That would keep most of the guard out of the fight. Not that it made the fight easy. Even with the armor and weapons they had been stealing, Atream's men were less trained than the guards, and while they were able to take advantage of their surprise for longer than they should have been, Atream soon found himself at the front of a small army of men crossing the bridge to the king's palace. He drew his sword as he stepped onto the bridge that led to the palace. It was his father's sword, his second sword, as Atream was the second brother. But it was the mirror of the sword Datros carried, and a sign both of their house and of nobility. Even the guards along the walls that watched him were not allowed to carry swords unless they had some claim to noble blood. He spoke loudly with the authority that his father had taught him, and the willingness to stand up to the king he had learned from growing up with a bad king. That was, he thought, the difference between himself and Datros. Datros had seen good leaders, so assumed others could be good. Atream had seen bad leaders and understood the cost of a man who put himself ahead of the kingdom.
This is a matter for the nobility. I would not ask any of you to fight and die for that. I ask only that the king come out and face me in single combat. If he is the rightful ruler, then the gods will protect him and he will be victorious. But if he killed his father and my father to take power, then they will allow me to cast him down.
The men on the walls looked at each other. Few of them knew what to do about that. Trial by combat wasn't entirely uncommon. King Vorgin the Second seemed to enjoy watching people fight for their lives. But Atream had strong doubts that he would agree to fight himself. It didn't matter. Cowardice would end his reign as certainly as a duel would, though it would take longer. As the captain of the guard sent a messenger to the king, some of Atream's troops began to talk, and the last person who Atream wanted to see made his way through the men who were here not to fight against their kingdom, but to bring justice to the king. Datros didn't wear any armor, and he hadn't drawn his weapon. Yet it seemed as if he was an army unto himself. He was wearing the full uniform of the sheriff. It was white and black with 2 rows of buttons up the front and a high collar. The sheath at his side held a sword that was the mirror of the one at Atream's side, and the knuckles of his hand were bloodied. It seemed that Atream had underestimated how hard Datros would work to escape the trap.
I am the king's champion. I will fight for him,
Datros said. Atream didn't know what to say. He had little doubt that he could win a fair fight against the king. But Datros was different. His brother had all the same trainers as Atream. The only difference was their ages. Datros may have slowed a hair, but he also had 10 years more training.
You don't have to do that. Let the king fight for himself,
Atream said, putting his hand on the hilt of the sword as his brother walked past him, positioning himself on the bridge between Atream and the palace.
I took an oath to my king and kingdom. I won't turn away from that,
Datros said.
That's what this all comes down to. Your honor is worth more to you than the entire kingdom,
Atream said, and he drew his sword. The two had trained together often. Datros had returned home at least once a year, and he had always taken the time to test his brother, and he had always been the better of the two. When they were younger, that was hardly surprising. Datros was 20 sparring against a 12-year-old. That had become even more clear after their father had died, and Atream didn't have him to train him. But this time things felt different. Atream attacked first, and Datros defended himself easily, but he didn't counterattack. At first, Atream thought it was a tactic. His brother was testing him, allowing him to attack until he made a mistake. It was a risky strategy, but one that against the right opponent could be successful. But that wasn't what he was doing.
Fight me if you're going to fight me,
Atream said, as Datros knocked away another blow.
If you're willing to kill me, that might matter, but you're not,
Datros said, reminding Atream of their conversation just a few minutes before.
I don't have to kill you,
Atream said, and believing that his brother wasn't going to attack him, he began to double down on his attacks. That would have been more effective if he was willing to kill his brother, but he was forced to hold back, because if his brother made even the smallest mistake, then he needed to be able to pull back. As the brothers clashed swords on the bridge leading to the palace, the tension in the air was palpable. Atream continued to press the attack, his frustration mounting with each blocked strike. Datros, on the other hand, skillfully parried every blow but refused to counterattack. The standoff continued for what felt like an eternity, both brothers locked in a duel that wasn't truly a fight to the death. Their movements were graceful, almost like a dance, but there was an underlying tension as they struggled to resolve their differences without resorting to true violence. The skill and the importance of the fight would have been enough, but their father's swords held a magic. Magic that Atream didn't fully understand. But what he knew was that each time the swords struck each other, there was a flash of light. A hush fell over the onlookers. The guards on the walls, Atream's men, and even some palace staff had gathered to witness this clash of wills. They sensed the significance of this moment, the choice between loyalty to the crown, loyalty to family, and loyalty to the people who the nobility claimed to serve. With each clash of swords, it became clearer to Atream what was happening. He had requested a trial, and his brother was giving him one, a chance to prove his case. But the question wasn't if he was a better sword fighter than Datros. It was a question of conviction. Atream really did believe that removing the king from power would be the best thing for the kingdom. What Datros wanted to know was whether he believed it enough to kill Datros to make it happen. Because if this was just a case of wanting revenge for their father's murder, then killing Datros wouldn't gain him anything. But Atream had seen children go hungry, so food could be sent to the military. He had seen people crying as their sons were recruited to prepare for wars that may never come. And he had spent every day for the last year in the woods with men who had given up everything to fight for this. There was no choice. He stopped holding back. Datros still refused to attack, so it was only a matter of time. He moved the sword fluidly, swinging first at Datros's legs and then his arms, then his head, then thrusting at his shoulder. The defense was remarkable, and each time the swords clashed, the flashes of light were brighter. Both of their father's swords had some magic in them, but all he knew for certain was that his father had said that while it wouldn't protect them from everything, it would protect them from the worst outcome, and that gave him some hope that his brother could survive the attack. Then he saw his opening. Datros was getting tired, and he allowed the tip of his sword to slip downward. It was a minor error, and yet more than enough for a trained swordsman. Atream's sword slid across the top of his brother's blade, but the swords weren't locked, and he was able to lift his blade so it went over the crossguard. There was a flash of light, brighter than any of the others, as the sword struck his brother in the neck. A killing blow. Except there was no blood. The sword remained where it was, encased in the bright colors. This was the magic of the sword. It was designed not to protect the person who carried it from physical harm, but from the harm caused by hurting the wrong person. Atream wondered if Datros had known that. It seemed likely that he had, because father had been alive when he gave Datros his sword, and so could have explained it. But by the time Atream had been given his sword, their father had already been murdered. Unable to move the sword and unable to let go of it, Atream was defenseless. Datros wouldn't need to use their father's sword to end the fight. The dagger at his belt would be more than enough. But he didn't do that. Datros dropped his sword and said,
"You have won. The trial is over. The gods have spoken, and the king is not worthy of the title. We must find another."
We already have. My men have known for a while who the king should be, and 5 of the 9 noble houses have agreed. I think once we contact them, the others will agree that you'll make a fine king.
Atream said. Datros just stood there. He seemed confused, so Atream continued.
You're the highest ranked person in the court, who everyone respects. And I've always believed you served the king because you thought you were helping people.
As he stood there confused, Atream knelt to bow before his brother and the new king. Wilbur, the other noble there, was the second, his bow just a hair lower than Atream's, who had just become prince. And by the time he had knelt, the soldiers were doing the same. Not just Atream's men who had known what was coming, but the soldiers defending the king as well. Atream had known that the military would honor and respect his brother in return for the honor and respect he had shown them, but it was good to see because it told him that they could avoid a civil war and have a good and faithful king.
Author's note: Atream and Datros are old friends to me. I first met them in the first true novel I ever wrote. I don't know if it exists anywhere but my head, which is probably good, because in my head it is good, and in reality it almost certainly wasn't. The two brothers were the main characters. They were transported to a strange, depopulated world where everyone had been brought from a different fantasy world due to a deep lore that I may use at some point. They are also all twisted versions of well-known stories or people. You may have noticed that this story is loosely based on Robin Hood and the Sheriff of Nottingham, except in this story, both are good men who just see the world differently. I hope you enjoyed it, and there is a small chance that they may return if I decide to revisit Shomanar. If I do, then we may get to spend more time with Datros and Atream. If you enjoyed this, you can get a free story every week by signing up for my newsletter at www.ansci-fi.com. Just look for the link that reads Free Book. Or you can get access to all of my stories for free, including Patreon exclusives, by signing up for my Patreon at any level. Thank you. Elton Gar.